Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to my co-panelists and to our audience. Thank you for attending this webinar today and this opportunity for what I think could be an important conversation from multiple perspectives on the intellectual and activist dynamism of this moment and whether the pain of the last couple of years will be enough to get a different result this time. Will the escalating discontent, voices, and power of working people represent an inflection point and moment for transformational change? As we all know, the pandemic and the intersecting economic, racial justice, democracy, and climate crises have laid bare and exacerbated the divides and disruption, the injustices and weaknesses that prevailed long before COVID. Our broken 20th century social compact, which has failed too many people, decades of neglect, of declining worker power, stagnant wages, glaring inequality, and a weak safety net. The gap between the promise of democracy or the American dream and the grim realities of life for so many, the loss of faith in institutions across the board. A key question at this moment is whether the relevant actors in business and labor and policymakers will be able to contemplate new approaches to economic and social justice, including labor rights, workplace protections, and labor management relationships. And importantly, what will it take to get them to that point? I believe that LERA is a unique forum for this kind of dialogue. I am Wilma Liebman. I am president of LERA, at least until this June, and earlier served as a long-term member and chair of the National Labor Relations Board. My partner in this webinar is Tom Kochan, known to everybody, a past president of LERA and distinguished scholar of workplace relations at MIT. This program grows out of multiple conversations and projects we've had. Before I proceed with the program, let me just urge all of you to attend LERA's 74th annual meeting, which unfortunately will be virtual, not in person, but still we have a great program lined up. It is Thursday to Sunday, June 2 to 5. The theme is Elevating Voice and New Voices in the Workplace and Beyond. A link to registration for the annual meeting you'll find in the chat. So today's program has three pieces. The first piece will be a discussion between Tom Kochan and me, a very quick tour giving an historical perspective on inflection points in labor management relations. Tom will introduce that. Second, Tom will introduce a new multidisciplinary research project spanning several universities, and he will introduce Jake Barnes from Rutgers, Johnny Collis from Cornell, and Fila Townsend from Rutgers, all PhD students working on this research project. And then third, I will have a discussion with commentary from two different vantage points with Noam Scheiber, the New York Times workplace reporter, prominent reporter, and always insightful, and Roy Bahat, whom I've come to know and learn a lot from in the last year. He's head of Bloomberg Beta, which I looked up how to describe Bloomberg Beta, and I'm going to quote their own words: an early stage venture capital firm which exists to expand Bloomberg's horizons by investing in companies that are creating profound change in how business operates, with a focus on machine intelligence and the future of work. So, and thank you to our audience. We certainly hope to hear from you after my discussion with Roy and Noam. So our first piece, as I said, is a quick tour through history, and I'm going to ask Tom Kochan to introduce that.
Thank you, Wilma. It's wonderful to be with our LERA family and our great panel of participants here today. As Wilma said, this is possibly a historical moment, but the question is, what will it take to make it a historical transition to a new era of labor management relations? And as Wilma said, as we have had conversations with various people, they've asked, well, have we had some inflection points like this in labor relations in the past? And so we put together a little video, which is in the chat, for you to watch if you would like. And what we're going to do is just quickly walk through some of the key points that we mentioned there. Most of these, if not all, are familiar to our LERA audience, so we're not going to go into depth. It's just to set the stage for a really in-depth, good discussion of where we are today. And Wilma is going to get us started by going back even before the Wagner Act to talk a little bit about some of what came before. So Wilma, you get us started and we'll go from here.
Okay, thank you. So we won't go in depth, but in the post-Civil War period, there was a period of intellectual and an active dynamism, in some ways similar to what we see today, with rapid industrialization and technological change, the abuses of industrial capitalism. With that, we saw soaring unemployment, extreme inequality, political agitation, and massive labor strife, often bloody. The labor question was debated, with industrial democracy seen as the answer to the labor question. But what industrial democracy meant was subject to radically diverse interpretations and experimentation. Some groups, like the Knights of Labor, promoted worker ownership of businesses. Their aim was to overthrow the wage labor system and private capitalism. Some unions experimented with early forms of collective bargaining. They sought improvements in wages and working conditions within the existing private enterprise and wage earner systems. More radical groups were pushing for more expansive transformation. With World War I, there was government intervention, and that was a major inflection point. Shop committees were set up in industries to control labor conflict. Many saw in these shop committees the possibility for them to grow into independent labor organizations. But that was not to be, because the post-World War I era was one of government and business repression of labor, and government pulled out of any kind of regulation. The 1920s were a period of economic boom, and large employers who were eager to forestall the emergence of powerful independent unions or government intervention set about a period of welfare capitalism with profit sharing and expansive benefits. They set up different kinds of employee representation plans, but these were costly, and most of these plans and with the period of welfare capitalism ended with the 1929 stock market crash. In 1933, the National Industrial Recovery Act was passed in an effort to jumpstart the economy. It included a provision protecting the right of workers to join unions and bargain collectively, but it had no teeth or enforcement mechanism. Unions grew during this period, but so did company unions. It ended up that the Supreme Court declared the National Industrial Recovery Act unconstitutional in a 1935 decision. A strike wave in 1933 and 1934 blanketed the nation in response to the economic conditions. The ranks of the unemployed joined in support of the striking workers, and this led in July 1935, to the enactment of the Wagner Act, which of course protected the right of workers to organize and bargain collectively. Importantly, it set up a government agency as an enforcement mechanism. So Tom, I'll let you take it from there.
Well, during the 1930s, not only did we get the National Labor Relations Act, but we got at the end, as World War II began in the early 1940s, the War Labor Board, which really laid a foundation for a lot of the principles that came later. The growth of fringe benefit bargaining on health insurance and others, wage structures that were well tuned to equity within industries and across occupations, encouraging labor management production committees and other innovations, but also grievance arbitration. And so by the time we get to the late 1940s, collective bargaining is viewed as here to stay. Unions had grown, industrial unions were growing rapidly and expanding through manufacturing and other industries.
So
This
Tom, can I
treaty-
interrupt just for a second before you
Sure,
get to the Treaty of Detroit? I think we should mention what happened in 1947, because certainly that was an
Yep.
inflection point. Followed a massive strike wave in 1946 at the end of the Second World War, leading in 1947 to the enactment of the Taft-Hartley amendments to the National Labor Relations Act. All of the provisions of Taft-Hartley were restrictions on unionization and collective bargaining, excluding categories of workers from the protections of the act and removing certain economic weapons from labor unions. President Truman vetoed the law, but it was enacted over his veto. And since then, we've had no significant amendment to the labor law, notwithstanding radical change in our society and economy. So let me then turn back to you.
Yeah, that's an important shift in labor management relations. This Treaty of Detroit is something that many of us view set up the social contract in the post-war decades, because basically what the UAW and General Motors did was to set a wage formula in place that increased wages in conjunction with growth in productivity and growth in the cost of living. And in return, labor said, okay, or union, the UAW said, we'll let GM manage its prerogatives on pricing and other issues. And so through collective bargaining and through what we call pattern bargaining, this wage norm spread throughout the post-war period. And this chart, which many of us use all the time to describe what happened after that, it shows that social contract worked. Wages and productivity, these two lines moved together up through the 40s, 50s, 60s, and into the 70s. And then around 1980, it broke apart. And we all know that since then, this social contract has broke down. Productivity continued to grow, but wages flatlined. And that's some of the pent-up pressures that we see today, this historical departure and growth of income inequality. But in the 1980s, there was some good news and some bad news. And I'm going to get to talk about the good news, because there was a lot of transformation of labor management relations going on then. Many of us documented this. We saw growth in worker and labor management participation at the workplace level, even up through corporate board representation in some places. There was more labor business dialogue in the country going on about what does this all mean? And we saw the emergence of new forms of work organization through so-called high performance work systems that people on this call participated in and helped to document so clearly. So we saw a lot of innovation in the 1980s, but much of that innovation didn't last in perpetuity. And in fact, it was combined or coexisted with some bad news that Wilma is going to be the deliverer of some of the bad news.
Yeah, so certainly the late 70s, early 80s were another inflection point with technological advance and globalization of markets. Manufacturing shrunk in this country. There was increasing pressure by Wall Street on firms to become more flexible, to lower labor costs. Business models altered, vertically integrated corporations began to disintegrate, workplaces fissured. The workplace and the nature of work were changing dramatically. Once secure employment was becoming precarious for workers, major industries were deregulated and established collective bargaining relationships, and millions of jobs were displaced. A deregulatory, laissez-faire economic policies took hold, enforcement of laws declined, anti-government dogma and rhetoric increased. And in this environment, resistance to unionization accelerated and became very sophisticated. Union-free became the desirable norm, but it fit with a long history of institutionalized anti-unionism in this country. And so beginning during this period, organized labor's power began to decline and has declined ever since. Workers' bargaining power eroded, work became more precarious and non-union, and the long, steady decline of unions in the private sector workforce began.
But it wasn't the end of innovation. We see another period of substantial innovation coming in the late 1990s, and particularly illustrated by Kaiser Permanente formation of a labor management partnership with a coalition of unions representing their employees. And it was born out of crisis and out of conflict, just as the Wagner Act was in the 1930s. This company had experienced a lot of strikes and wage cuts in the decade prior to the agreement to create a labor management partnership. The importance of Kaiser can't be overstated. It's the largest, the broadest, and the longest lasting labor management partnership we've ever seen in American labor relations. It's been very successful. It reversed the financial decline and losses and replaced it with 2 decades of financial gains for the organization. It's innovated in bringing successful use of interest-based negotiations, and it continues to pay industry leading wages and benefits. But the heart of it, in some respects, is right down there at the workplace, where there are well over 4,000 teams. They call them unit-based teams, where the parties negotiated to set up these teams for problem solving at the organizational level, at the unit level. You have doctors and nurses and technicians and service employees all working together to improve patient care, using this innovative compass to guide them around the patient and member focus that they're addressing. This partnership, like all partnerships, was tested in last year's bargaining. They went right up to a strike deadline, but they reached an agreement that sustains the partnership and is providing a path forward. So these are just some of the inflection points that we thought were worth highlighting to put what's going on today in perspective. And now, Wilma, so what is happening today? How do we begin to think about some of these current issues before we turn to discussion of them in depth?
Yeah, well, I look back about 10 years, actually 2011, when Occupy Wall Street began. A year later, the Fight for 15 began in New York City with walkouts in several McDonald's and other fast food stores. The Fight for 15 has increased over the years to walkouts and protests all over the country and globally. Involving millions of low-wage workers. While it has not yet achieved union representation for the most part in the US at fast food stores, it has resulted in thousands of workers learning the meaning of collective action, and it's resulted in minimum wage hikes all over the country. This activism has grown over the years, little by little, but I think it grew by leaps and bounds over the period of the pandemic. Some of it is led by social media, some by social movements like Me Too and Black Lives Matters. There have been links with community groups and immigrants groups and increasingly climate concern groups. There is growing discontent and mobilization that's obvious with union organizing going on in a variety of industries. Noam Scheiber certainly writes about all of this in retail and digital media with nonprofits and video gamers and graduate students, adjunct faculty. Now, of course, the high profile campaigns at Amazon and Starbucks and REI and Apple and Target now. Even the knowledge economy is seeing worker activism with walkouts at Google and other employers. And even amongst excluded workers, activism amongst public sector workers, farm workers, Uber drivers who are treated as independent contractors, and domestic workers. I think there are sharp echoes of the intellectual and activist ferment of a century ago when the labor question was debated. Old ideas about industrial democracy are being reimagined and new strategies explored. Workers are making their voices heard outside of the established collective bargaining structures and testing novel strategies. So I think we are witnessing a potentially transformative dynamism of both thought and action that we've not seen in decades.
So let's take a little deeper dive into what is going on. And let me tell you a little bit about this new institution that a number of us have created. We call it the Worker Empowerment Research Network. It's an interdisciplinary network of researchers who have come together to study all of the issues we are talking about today. How are we experiencing efforts to gain greater voice, power, and representation for workers? and looking especially at those most in need of stronger voice and representation, people of color, women, immigrants, others who have faced exclusion and discrimination over time. This network came together just as the Amazon and other organizing efforts were being created. We are working in partnership with the U.S. Department of Labor. We have a cooperative agreement with them to work on these issues. And we have a really good team of people that is working together, including the three people that you're going to hear from in the next phase here. Our first effort of this network was to put together what we call a landscape review. And in fact, today is sort of the premier discussion of this landscape review. And it was led by a group of PhD students working with us to collect data on the current landscape of activity. And we're going to hear from three of them. We're going to hear first from Johnny Callis at Cornell, and then we're going to hear from Jake Barnes from Rutgers, and then from Phila Townsend, also at Rutgers, about some of the things that are covered in this review. Just to set the stage, we're also working with our colleagues Janice Fine, Kate Brofenbrenner, and Suresh Naidu, well-known experts in our field. We have other team members as well, and our great editor, Martha Mangelsdorf, is putting this document that you're going to hear about into a form that we will launch and distribute when it's presentable in about 2 weeks. But just to set the stage, you know, some of us have worked on this for a long time. We did national surveys asking, what do workers really want? Do they still want unions? This data shows that yes, they want unions today more than ever before. And in fact, they want a voice on a very wide range of issues, including the traditional wages, hours, and benefits of collective bargaining, but also on respect, protections from abuse, on new technologies, even on the values that their firm stands for and the products and the services that they help to produce. So what we have here today is an explosion of activity that reflects the pent-up pressures of both that income inequality that we mentioned earlier, as well as the demand and expectation for a stronger voice. And what kind of voice? This is a complicated chart, but basically it shows that collective bargaining still is a high priority, but also is a provision of benefits at work, protections and legal protections against abuse, and a voice in corporate governance at the workplace and at corporate levels. So this sets the stage for what we're going to hear from Johnny and Jake and Phila about what we observe going on out there today. So Johnny, why don't you take us through some of the current NLRB activity? And I'm going to say one thing about Johnny, because I think he'll be too modest to say it. He's going to talk about something called the ILR labor tracker, and it fills in a big gap that the government has given up since 1980, collecting data on strikes across the economy, and only collects it on large strikes. And to Johnny and his colleagues' credit at the ILR school at Cornell, they've stepped in and developed this tracker. So this is just an appreciation for a very innovative step. Johnny?
Great, thanks so much, Tom. I really appreciate that. So hi, everybody. I'm going to summarize recent developments in NLRB organizing and strike activity, and then I'll pass it along to Jake. So despite many of the obstacles faced by workers organizing through the regulated NLRB process, there has been a notable increase in board certification elections during the first half of fiscal year 2022. Union election petitions, as you can see on your screen, increased 57% over this time period, reversing a long-standing trend of decline in NLRB organizing. A considerable portion of this recent growth is due to the rapid spread of organizing by Starbucks workers, referred to by the company as partners. And as of May 12th, just a few days ago, workers from over 250 stores have already petitioned for an NLRB election, and over 60 stores, I believe now the count is closer to 70, have voted to unionize, with those numbers growing every day. We can go to the next slide, Tom. Thanks. So it's not yet possible to determine whether high-profile victories at Starbucks and Amazon will lead to a more permanent wave of organizing through the NLRB process. We do not need to look further than the recent and ongoing campaigns at Starbucks and Amazon to understand how employer opposition continues to thwart and delay union organizing campaigns. So the NLRB has filed complaints against both corporations for violating labor law in numerous instances, including illegally terminating union activists. Negotiations for a first agreement have begun at some Starbucks stores, though none yet have achieved a contract. And without the threat of punitive damages, employers may continue to delay and refuse to make meaningful progress at the table with newly organized workers. So I think it's very clear building unions in such difficult circumstances requires worker-centered campaigns that organize around both workplace issues and social identities, which has become common in both Amazon and Starbucks campaigns, really emphasizing the linkage between the two. So strikes represent another source of worker power that until recently had been in decline across the United States. And unlike changes in the unionization rate, it has been difficult to understand trends in strikes due to limitations in official data sources that Tom briefly talked about. So a group of researchers, including myself, we began a project in 2021 called the ILR Labor Action Tracker to more comprehensively document strike activity. We documented 265 work stoppages involving approximately 140,000 workers in 2021, which I would say is in stark contrast to the 16 large work stoppages involving about 80,000 workers tracked by the BLS over that same time period. And as you can see on our screen, our data from 2021 demonstrates several important and somewhat surprising findings about strikes in the United States today. So first, nearly 1/3 of all strikes in 2021 were organized by non-union workers. While these strikes were substantially smaller than union-led strikes, they indicate an increased willingness by non-union workers to collectively organize and improve their working conditions. Second, the scope of labor activism is clearly expanding. So workers organize strikes around a variety of demands from 2021, most commonly around pay and healthcare, but also including health and safety concerns, end to sexual harassment in the workplace, and racial justice. And finally, we somewhat surprisingly documented a nearly equal number of strikes in the South as we did in the Northeast and the West. Which provides more proof of the expansion of labor activism beyond what might be considered traditional union strongholds. We go to the next slide, Tom. Thanks. And then finally, while it's difficult to discuss trends without reliable data over time, strikes appear to be on the rise since the Red State teacher walkouts in 2018. And in contrast to the long and drawn-out conflicts typical of strikes in the mid to late 20th century, workers have increasingly organized shorter duration strikes that seek to pressure companies and win community support by taking on more of a public forum. So a good example of this are strikes associated with the Bargaining for the Common Good framework that attempt to center the demands of both workers and community groups in the bargaining process. Recent teacher strikes in Chicago and Minneapolis offer good examples of this framework as educators fought for issues like smaller class sizes that also want support from community stakeholders. However, like union organizing, inadequate laws continue to restrict the right to strike in this country, An obvious example of this is the ability of employers to still permanently replace workers on an economic strike. So recently, during the nearly 10-month strike by Massachusetts nurses in Worcester, which was the longest strike of 2021, the hospital hired over 100 permanent replacements, which really resulted in the strike continuing 4 months longer than was necessary as both sides negotiated on a return to work agreement. So I think that's it for me at this point. I'm going to turn it over to Jake, who will discuss recent developments in worker centers. Thank you.
Thanks, Johnny, and thank you, Tom and Wilma and LERA for organizing, and to you all for being here. So I'll give an update on worker centers. Worker centers are community-based organizations that support and organize communities of low-wage workers. Despite having a strong focus on worker issues and sometimes engaging and working in partnership with unions, worker centers are not unions. They do not collectively bargain or organize workplaces for ongoing representation. Rather than being worksite-based, they're place-based, and their work and power building efforts tend to consist of some combination of service provision, policy and advocacy work, and organizing. The cornerstone of these centers' work is developing a base of workers who collectively take action on their own behalves, and much of this action centers around issues like the recovery of unpaid wages, passage of strengthened employment rights, or more substantial penalties for employers who violate labor laws. Worker centers have also been key players in the immigrant rights movement. As you can see from this chart, the growth of worker centers since 1980 has largely grown alongside the total foreign-born population. Organizers turned to the worker center model in the late 70s and 80s as immigration was surging, pathways to legalization were contracting, employment was becoming more precarious, and unionization amongst low-wage workers had been flat for some time. And although worker centers were being established throughout the 1980s and 1990s, the growth in the numbers was modest until the year 2000. And as of the end of 2021, there were at least 246 active worker centers that we identified. And since the last time that we updated, Janice Fine and I updated this database, and with the help of Phila Townsend and Danielle Twiss, we identified 12 new centers that have emerged since 2018. 36 states and DC are home to at least one worker center, and 5 states are home to collectively over half of all worker centers, and those are California, New York, Illinois, Massachusetts, and Texas. Some other key takeaways that we want to emphasize: since 2018, 5 new Black worker centers have emerged, comprising almost half of the newly emergent centers over the past few years, and many are part of the National Black Worker Center Network. And among worker centers with a specific sectoral focus, 28 focus particularly on domestic workers. Most of them are part of the National Worker Center Federation, known as the National Domestic Workers Alliance. 20 are focused exclusively on day laborers, most of which are part of the National Day Labor Organizing Network, or NDLON, and others are focused on farm workers, restaurant workers, construction workers, and others. But notably, over 60% of all worker centers work across multiple sectors or industries. And among the 12 new centers over recent years, 7 are multi-sectoral, and the remaining focus exclusively on domestic workers or restaurant workers. And while characteristics of the low-wage labor market, such as exclusion from federal labor and employment law coverage and high proportion of undocumented workers, have limited the structural power of worker center constituents and made construction of mass membership-based worker organizations difficult, worker centers have compensated for this lack of structural and associational power by focusing on public policy change and government administrative action. And despite their lack of direct economic action, worker centers have been instrumental in state and local policy campaigns, including raising the minimum wage, enacting wage theft laws, adopting paid sick and safe time laws, and passing domestic workers' Bill of Rights. And I think it's important to note also that as most of these centers and worker center federations are organized as 501c3 organizations. Some have begun moving into electoral politics through the establishment of new 501c4 organizational arms to involve their organizations more directly in voter outreach and electoral work. And in terms of the issues that worker centers focus on, of course, while fundamental issues like wages and working conditions are still front and center for many of these centers, there are several recent trends worth highlighting. Particularly given the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic raised the level of public and policy attention to the poor working conditions and lack of basic health and safety protections afforded to many workers, particularly essential workers, 43% of whom are from communities of color and more than 5 million of whom are undocumented immigrants. Mutual aid funds for undocumented workers have been set up through the National Worker Center Federations, as well as through many individual worker centers. And through their advocacy, essential worker funds have been established by state legislatures in various states, such as New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, and California. We also see a growing number of worker centers focused on climate crises impacting workers, particularly on the West Coast. And finally, while countering anti-immigrant activities and addressing immigration policy reform has long been a focus of worker centers, there's been even greater attention devoted to immigration-related issues over the past few years due to growing anti-immigrant policies and politics. And before passing it off to Phila, I will just note that most worker centers and worker center federations continue to rely on funding from foundations or from other outside sources such as government or individual donors. Only a small fraction of worker center revenues come from dues paying workers, and whether or how worker centers could develop more self-sustaining sources of revenue is an important topic of ongoing discussion. So with that, I will turn it over to Phila.
Hi, everyone. I just want to quickly take us through this slide, not say much really, other than to give you a chance to just take a look at the small offerings, I think, compared to the broader landscape of worker organizing that's happening. We just wanted to give you a sense for who is organizing into or as unions versus what we've sort of classified here as organizations, associations, and platforms, where we see a growing diversity. So these are just some examples of probably, I would argue, the larger, more national level organizations, but there's quite a bit of things happening at more local, regional, and state levels as well. And the next slide, Tom. Thank you. Just here, I'm going to give just a top line of some of the key takeaways that we look at as we said, this sort of growing category of organizing efforts and activities of newer organizational forms and strategic initiatives. I'll just hit some maybe key implications as we look across these. So one, as we've said, it's growing. And involves a diverse and wide range of workers spanning, as we've said, sectors and communities. I think this is just important to note. We've said perhaps we're in a historic moment, but I think either way, I'm not sure, maybe since some previous or earlier civil rights movements, that have we seen this kind of wide array of diversity of worker organizing at various income levels across sectors and backgrounds and experiences of workers. Much of this is likely due to the facilitation that newer technologies have offered. But as we know, as labor and employment folks, a lot of this has been driven by the change in the world and work structures and the growing precariousness that we're seeing across a growing swath of worker and worker communities. The second point here is, many of these organizations are, of course, focused on developing greater capacity to build more durable organizations, to exercise workers' voices, not only engaging with employers on a more ongoing basis, but as we see in many of these newer organizational forms, there's really a desire to address the needs of respecter worker communities. So it begs the question and raises this issue about how we, and we'll get into that discussion, I'm sure, but how we think about, the best way to support this growing diversity, not just of workers, but of the kinds of issues that workers are saying they want voice on. So I think Tom mentioned that earlier. The next point here is, like unions, these organizations face fierce managerial opposition and resistance. And I think, as Wilma noted, we see a growing expansion and sophistication of employer resistance. And particularly, I think, again, as new technologies have offered a boon for workers. On the other hand, there's also an opportunity for us to be looking at how these newer technologies also create new pathways for managerial opposition to workers. Next point is, an increasing number of these worker organization and efforts, not surprisingly, given the era that we're in, are digital tech-based, or we see relying more heavily on online platforms and tools to engage and organize workers. So some important questions here about, again, what role technologies and digital transformations have, both on impacting worker experiences, both in the workplace and as well as offline or outside of workplaces, but also what it means for workers who are trying to leverage technological tools to build power. Next point here, I think also Jake might have alluded to this around worker centers, but we see this more broadly across these other organizational forms. So, while some are supported by unions, most do rely on foundation support. I think this point's very much connected to point 2 around how we think about supporting the capacity building of these organizations and how we think about new structures and or pathways to offer funding and resourcing support to this new and emerging generation of worker organizing. And then last, this it's an important point here, the experienced substantial increase in requests for support during the pandemic, again, not surprising, and we're probably very aware of the challenges workers were facing. But this point does speak to as worker organizations are emerging, as workers are coming together to organize themselves or getting various kinds of support, whether it's technical or educational assistance from worker organizations, there's this question of how we manage the growing and massive scale that this work is happening on. So I'll stop there and let Tom take over.
Well, thank you, Phila. One of the purposes of doing this landscape review, and in fact of WERN, this Worker Empowerment Research Network in general, is to bring these issues out of our specialized conversations into a broad national public debate. if we are going to make progress on these issues, then we are going to both have to fix our labor policies and update them to accommodate the multiple ways in which workers want to find a voice, and which ways in which employers can work with labor organizations, both in traditional and in creative ways. And so we are actually encouraged by some of the discussions we hear from some business groups, not enough yet, but some, from foundation support, as we heard, from think tanks and universities and others, and from some state and federal government commissions, including the president's task force on the future of unions and collective bargaining. I think all of this is opening up the door to a broader, more full-bodied conversation, to bring these stakeholders together, as we do here at LERA, and to really make sure that this time, when there's a potential historical transition, we bring our voices into helping to shape that transition in ways that really do make sustained progress over time. That's our objective, and that's why we put this research group together. We invite all of you to participate with us. As I said, we will have this report out in a few weeks, and it'll be available for you to use and to discuss with people in your communities. So this is what we are doing. And now we get to the really most interesting part of this conversation by hearing from Wilma, who's going to lead and moderate a discussion with Roy Bahat and with Noam Scheiber. So Wilma, I'm going to turn it over to you, and we will end all of these PowerPoints. So
Good.
go to it.
So before I turn only to Roy and Noam, Tom, let me just ask you one question, because I think you may have left out of our historical tour the final point you wanted to make about Starbucks and the Starbucks campaign. Did you want to add that before, sort of to frame my discussion with Noam and Roy?
Sure, I'm happy to. I mean, one of the things that reasons we put those inflection points historically together was to set up basically the question that I think is on so many of our minds. And that is, we watch this traditional organizing process and strong managerial resistance coming in Starbucks. And here's a company that has done some very good things, has a good reputation with customers, and in many respects with many of its workers. But now they're involved in this traditional negative campaign on the management side and a strong response on the workers' side. The question is, can't we shape a better alternative? Aren't there better ways in which we can work together to provide real worker voice and representation and positive labor management relations? That's the debate we have, I think, to take on. We have some things to say about that, and we look forward to seeing if we can't make a contribution. So now, Wilma, let's go to your panel. And by the way, if people in the audience have questions or things you want to put in the chat, we'll start monitoring the chat now. And after we hear from our panelists, we will open this up to everyone.
Thank you, Tom, and thanks for making the point about putting your questions in the chat, because we will want to hear from you. So let me start with you, Noam. Obviously, you've been writing for years now about a lot of topics, but especially the surge in worker activism, organizing and strikes. I can remember a few years ago, a conversation I had with you when the incident about Colin Kaepernick taking a knee occurred. And you said, I think we're in a concerted activity moment. Well, I think that moment has just continued and escalated. So surely this is a unique moment, even historic. But is it an inflection point? Is it a turning point with the potential for real change, especially given the intersecting crises of the last few years and what's been exposed about the inadequacies of our current system? Do you see this as a turning point or transformational?
Thanks, Wilma, and thanks, Tom. This has been great so far. It's obviously the question on everyone's mind, as you say. One of the things I've done over the past month or so, really since the Amazon win on Staten Island, was just to try to think historically about where this would fit in. And, you know, you guys touched on this, and probably the biggest inflection point in, you know, modern labor history was in the mid to late 1930s, when the rate of union membership went from, you know, low double digits, 11-12%, to, you know, high 20s, 27-28% in just about a 5-year period. And, you know, I don't think we saw something before or since, you know, that kind of growth. And so I just kind of went back to that era and tried to think through, you know, what prompted that real revolution. And I do think there are some echoes of that era in this moment. You know, clearly we're coming out of, or we're in the Depression, but coming out of the most traumatic phase of the Depression. So you have unemployment hit 25% in 1933, but by the mid 30s, things are kind of moving in the right direction. You're down to the kind of mid to high teens. We do get a recession in 37, 38. But when the kind of wave of strikes, of sit down strikes, starts to happen in 36, I think things are, you know, there's a sense that the economy is moving in the right direction. So in a way like today, where you have the kind of trauma of the pandemic, and then you have the great resignation and the labor shortages, you have this moment of intense trauma, and then a kind of, you know, an improvement that I think maybe emboldens workers. So I think you have that element. You obviously have, in both cases, a pretty friendly administration. You mentioned some of the legislation, the kind of landmark legislation that gets passed in the 30s, you know, kind of culminating, or on the labor side, peaking with the NLRA. You know, very friendly administration in Washington, a very activist general counsel of the NLRB today. And then, you know, I think politically, clearly inequality is a big deal. In the, you know, by the mid 30s, it's not quite where it was in the 20s or just before World War I, but still remains a big deal. And, you know, you have this moment where, you know, some of the major manufacturers are starting to do incredibly well. You know, GM, the site of the sit down strikes in Flint that spread across the country, is, you know, starting to do incredibly well, you know, 1935, 36, 37. And so I think you have a kind of, you know, I don't want to overstate the analogy, but you have a kind of Amazon-like situation, you know, where all the workers can see that the company's done, you know, has been doing incredibly well during this period that's been pretty traumatic for workers. And so I do think there is some frustration with the disparity between how the company's doing, how the shareholders are doing, how the executives are doing, and how the rank and file workers are doing. So, so yeah, I do think you have, you know, some kind of fundamentals in place that we last saw in that moment of incredible, you know, growth for unions. As you say, the question is it enough? You know, does it put us in a transformational moment? You know, I guess I'm more cautious. Obviously, the economy has changed quite a bit since the 30s. Automation undercuts workers' leverage. Globalization undercuts workers' leverage. You know, you get into places, you know, parts of the economy where you can't outsource, but then you have other factors that undermine worker leverage a bit. You know, I think clearly when you talk about worker opposition, it's very hard to not talk about the transition from a manufacturing-based economy to a service-based economy. If you look at the proportion of costs that labor accounts for in a manufacturing concern, it's just going to be lower than in a service, you know, in a kind of customer-facing service economy. I think now, you know, if you look at manufacturing today, you know, the big three automakers, their labor costs are kind of 10-15% of revenue, and for a company like Starbucks, it's more like 25% to 30%. And so, you know, for a big service economy employer like Starbucks, you know, a much bigger part of the game is just going to be like labor cost minimization. And when your goal is labor cost minimization, then you're just going to invariably be more hostile to unionization. So I think that's, you know, that's a big part of the challenge. And, you know, it does get a bit at the question that Tom raised is, you know, you have companies like Starbucks that are, you know, that kind of brand themselves in progressive ways, and that, you know, in some ways are actually very progressive. I mean, Starbucks was pretty early to provide healthcare to part-time employees. They were early to the, you know, giving employees equity game, but if so much of your bottom line is based on labor cost minimization, it's just going to be a really tough proposition, and you probably are going to fight pretty relentlessly in a way that even we don't think of the 30s of being the age of the enlightened employer, but when labor costs just present a substantially smaller portion of your total cost structure, and you kind of see the writing on the wall, eventually I think you can be a little more pragmatic than maybe you can be if you're a Howard Schultz and you just imagine that you're just going to get killed by investors if you can't control this thing. So yeah, I do think those things make it a different environment. I think the kind of silver lining is I think for there to be kind of real gains, we don't need to go from 10% to 30% union density. Even if we were to go from 10% to 13, 14, 15%, I think that just on its own terms that would be millions of workers. But also we've seen a lot of the research that folks like Jake Rosenfeld have done and people like that show that unionization, the benefits spread pretty widely even among non-union workers within a similar industry. So if we were to increase a kind of couple percentage points in union density, and you'd kind of get that first order effect of the millions of workers brought under collective bargaining agreements, and then pretty robust second order effects of workers at companies that do not have collective bargaining agreements but still benefit from the perceived threat of unionization among their employers. So I think overall, I suspect the growth, if we are on a kind of upsurge, to be much more modest, but it could have real profound effect for millions and millions of workers.
That's really very complete answer. Thank you for all your thinking. So we're going to come back to you, but Roy, let me turn to you for a moment, because I know that your interest and knowledge about these issues follows a different path than Noam's. Yet you've come to be deeply concerned about the existing state of affairs for workers. One of the things that you and I have talked about and regret is the fact that there is an absence of any kind of meaningful dialogue between labor and business at this stage, and there's been for quite a while. So tell us your road to these issues, and do you see this as a potentially transformational moment?
Thank you, Wilma. And Noam and I come from some of the same academic beginnings, and so maybe different paths to the same place. So for me, I've always been concerned with, call it, economic participation questions. How many people in American life, if they do what they think they're supposed to do, can they thrive economically? And about 10 years ago, I started doing what I do now, which is that I'm a startup investor. I'm a business person who focuses on technology. And like many of us in the technology industry, and especially for us at our firm, because we were the first firm to say that we wanted to invest in artificial intelligence, we started to become concerned about the effect of automation and this wave of automation and technology on the availability of work for Americans. I mean, more broadly, but that's just the place that I know. And in 2017, we did this study with Anne-Marie Slaughter and New America, trying to anticipate scenarios for how technology might affect work in the United States. And I'm not actually a big believer in the power of experts to make predictions. So I'm actually going to try to avoid predicting whether this is a transformative moment or not, because A, I don't know, and B, it's kind of up to us. But the takeaway from that scenario planning exercise, which was looking out 10 or 20 years in the future, is we didn't need to worry about the future of work at all, because all the problems that we had already existed plenty in the present. And this was around the same time that the data was coming out about the proportion of American families who couldn't handle a $400 expense, unexpected expense, and then Trump got elected while we were doing this work. And I saw that moment, that expression of extremism, when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And so I tend to look at things through an economic lens. And I saw it as an act of desperation from people who were struggling economically and attributed that struggle to all kinds of other things, notably, anti-immigration sentiment and racism. And so I set off kind of to try to understand, all right, if it's the present that's broken, what are some of the solutions that we can look toward? And many of the solutions ultimately depend on some form of government action. I started looking at things like guaranteed income and sort of some more out there policies, but also, what was the state of play around expanding health benefits, et cetera. And in the last presidential election, I had a personal experience, which is that I moved with my family to Wisconsin to vote. My wife is from Wisconsin, so we moved there before the election to vote and organize there. And I saw what I believe is the absolute futility of the way we practice getting out the vote in the United States. And that is that once every 2 to 4 years, we flash fund a bunch of organizations that go around and knock on doors and effectively say something like, hey, I know you don't really know me, maybe I live in the neighborhood, and I know you haven't really thought about government that much, but could you please do this thing that is kind of a pain to do, that I know you do once every 4 years, that probably won't really affect your life directly if you do it. And we just make this, this civic responsibility argument, and the data just doesn't seem to work. And I started studying what some of the other approaches would be. And I was very struck by this line from the political scientist Hari Hahn at Johns Hopkins, where she said, democracy is a muscle. And I just started looking at other organizations that could function democratically. And you've got the PTA, but that doesn't really appeal to that many people. You've got, and you've got worker organizations. I mean, that's a thing that almost every adult American does and could participate in. And at the same time, I saw two things in the business world, and then I'll stop. One is in the tech world, where the concentration of power within tech companies by their CEOs is so outsized. I mean, many of them have special share structures that allow them to have more voting power, or just de facto, whether they do or they don't, they are the monarchs of their companies. And I saw one company after another changing its policies because of actually relatively modest organizing efforts among their employees. Google stopped selling a certain kind of AI to the US government because of an open letter from not that many Google employees. Amazon and Jeff Bezos shifted their stance on climate change because of a few women at Amazon who organized on climate change. And this wasn't, this is the kind of alternative worker organization that Philo was talking about. These weren't even unionization efforts, and this was before Workers United and Starbucks, but I just saw that power in this industry where government couldn't get them to change, customer boycotts couldn't get them to change, the Wall Street couldn't get them to change. It's like, wait a minute, here's a constituency that actually has meaningful leverage. And then the last thing is, I was the only investor who participated as a member of the California Governor's Commission on the Future of Work, which was chaired by Mary Kay Henry, who runs SEIU. And I saw the way that many of the traditional labor folks had, I'm just going to name this, had sort of given up on some level. They had this tone that was a tone of, complaining as opposed to acting, of, belief in their existing institutions as opposed to new ways. And I just kind of shook my head and thought, this can't be what it is. And, I see Mary Kay Henry as somebody who's been an innovator and a leader in funding and supporting new approaches, and National Domestic Workers Alliance was represented, and One Fair Wage was represented, and had all this energy and new approaches. And so, the startup person in me just said, wait a minute, we've got these green shoots of emerging innovation, almost to a person, by the way, led by women, all kinds of new organizational forms. And so my curiosity just kicked into overdrive. And I've spent the last 2 years with the belief that, because I can't think of any better alternative, and I'm happy to go through any of them with folks, that the only chance we have as a country for an economy and society where more people can participate is if we have much more and much more effective worker organizing. And the kind of the coda to this, and Wilma and Tom, you've both been involved in this, is actually, I think, Wilma, it was your urging, is when we talked about this, you said, well, you're a business person, go organize the business people. And it has been punishingly difficult. In fact, several prominent professors, not Tom, said you don't have a chance of doing this, but we put together a group of business leaders who are what I'd call labor open. You know, they're not pro-union business leaders. Some of them accept unions as a matter of necessity in the industry they're in. They work in construction or something like that, or lead a unionized workforce, but they all get that the knee-jerk habits of the business world right now need to change. And I think the knee-jerk habits of the labor world need to change too. And so we're in this moment of kind of simultaneous reinvention. And that's how I got here, by process of elimination.
Yeah, well, thank you. I was hoping you were going to end on that note, because the next question I have for both you and Noam is, to the extent that it's not certain that this is really going to be transformational, and transformational in what we all would agree was a positive way. I mean, I guess 1946 was another transformational moment in response to a massive strike wave. And the Congress went majority Republican for the first time since 1930, and we got the Taft-Hartley Act. So I'm not sure we would view that was transformational, but not in the way we think is necessary now. So how do we get us there? How do we bridge the political divides? How do we bridge the knee-jerk no in the business world? How do we get the labor world to be open to broader approaches? So you must have some ideas about what it's going to take to get us there. Noam, let me start with you. You're muted.
All right. Yeah, great question, obviously. I used to be someone who thought that things were relatively hopeless as long as labor law was where it was, where the law is weak and enforced even worse. The law is weak and enforcement is even weaker. That seemed like not a recipe for success. And I guess my views on that have changed a bit over the past year or so. The law is clearly still pretty weak, but the enforcement piece, we see that it can be enforced much more or less aggressively. And I think Jenna Bruzzo has kind of come out pretty aggressively. Obviously, the NLRB is still an agency that's pretty heavily resource constrained, and so that limits how quickly they can process everything from election petitions to seeking injunctions to on behalf of workers to filing complaints. But clearly, even within a relatively weak legal framework, there is room for aggressive enforcement. So that's something that has changed my mind a bit about the kind of legal regime. This next thing I think is more controversial, but I increasingly believe it. So as Roy said, I think there is a lot more leverage that workers have, and when deployed strategically can be quite effective. And as Roy said, I mean, we clearly saw that at Google and Amazon and Apple, but among the white collar folks, but I think even, I've been struck. I've been talking to Amazon workers at different facilities around the country, and just kind of trying to think through the impact of the JFK 8 win on Staten Island. And in some cases, it has set in motion an effort to circulate cards and file petitions. But in other cases, it's just caused people to sort of double down on sort of solidarity, union organizing, or just kind of informal organizing. And I think the workers realize that they do have more leverage than people might have, than they might have appreciated a few years ago, and that outsiders certainly would have appreciated. One conversation, stuck out in my mind. There was one of the kind of informal, or not informal, but formal, but not NLRB certified groups is Amazonians United, and they have a presence in a number of warehouses around the country. I think they sort of started in the Chicago area. And in talking to one of their early members, they really were very strategic about how they understood the kind of the sort of cost benefit proposition facing Amazon and the leverage they had within that. And, Amazon, like, many traditional manufacturing facilities, has these bottlenecks. and the bottlenecks become even more they loom even more prominently during key moments, during the winter, the holiday season, during their kind of summer prime period. And what they realized is, you have these delivery stations around the country that are much smaller than a fulfillment center where they kind of initially pack the stuff and sort it. But the delivery station is where it goes from like the package into a truck and then gets, it's the kind of, close to the last mile of the Amazon logistical footprint. And you have, at a lot of these delivery stations, you have 100, 200, 300 people total, which means on any given shift, you may have 50, 60, maybe even 30 or 40 people. And if during, a holiday season or some kind of peak moment for Amazon, you were to get half of those 40 or 50 people who are on duty to walk out, that basically cripples Amazon for that geographic area. And so it turns out that even though this company now employs 1 million people in the United States and over 1.5 million people worldwide, a few dozen people can actually have enormous influence over their operations. And I think that insight is incredibly powerful. And I think there's a lot of leverage that follows from that. And there is a lot of negotiation, a lot of bargaining, a lot of collective bargaining that can happen as a result of that insight, even without an NLRB certified union. And, clearly not every company is going to have these bottlenecks and these kind of soft underbellies in the same way that Amazon does, but I bet they exist at a lot of places. And when you have workers who are kind of thinking strategically about where those bottlenecks lie, it turns out that, the bar is not nearly as high as we thought the bar was to have influence within this kind of organization. So I think we're learning things like that are incredibly powerful. And the kind of corollary, which I think is probably the most controversial thing, is I have found that it's often this mix of college educated people, people who graduated from college, people who went to college but didn't graduate, and people who didn't go to college at all, that is incredibly potent in that context. That you find that, you have this, at the risk of getting bogged down in a debate about vanguardism and, taking us back to the 30s. I do think that there is a kind of cadre of people who kind of, know their labor rights. They know what protected concerted activity is. They know where within the organization and where within the hierarchy and where within the logistical footprint it can be applied. Some of them are sort of activists by disposition. Some of them are activists almost by profession. But that mix of people who have gotten into these organizations and have begun kind of organizing from the inside and have begun to sort of think strategically and make alliances with other folks. That I think has also been very powerful. And we've really seen that play out at Starbucks. We've seen it play out at Amazon. We've seen it play out at Apple and REI. And so I think we can't be sort of blind to where a lot of the kind of cutting edge of the organizing is. And I do think you find it where you get this sort of mix of people with educational backgrounds and experiences also. I realize that's a bit more controversial, but it's definitely consistent with my reporting over the past year or so.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because you had an interesting story in the Times just recently about the wave of college graduate organizing, and perhaps they feel less fear. We have only 2 questions in the chat, which I do want to try to get to, but Roy, let me turn to you first, and then hopefully we'll leave some time in case anyone else has a question besides the 2 in the chat.
Yeah, well, I was actually going to respond to Joel Gershenfeld's question as part of this, because the
Good.
question is, what advice would we give to frontline folks who are leading this innovation? And so I approach that in the same way that I would as a startup investor with founders, which is, that's really not up to me. Meaning, I think the best thing that all of us can do is listen to the frontline folks about what they're describing as their priorities, try to figure out how to support them, and then we can share our observations on things we're seeing. But if you ask me kind of what does it take for what we're seeing to continue to replicate, the thing that I would say is, first of all, is treatment of those frontline leaders as the as leaders who are deserving of every form of support we can muster. I mean, as I've talked to folks who are doing some of the innovation and creating the organization, do you have a coach? You know, what kind of training have you been through? You know, simple kind of block and tackling stuff like that can go such a long way. And one of my observations, and I can speak to this with some confidence, is that there is a tremendous amount of cluelessness among labor leaders about how business actually works. And, you know, including things like not knowing the difference between realizing a return through profit versus realizing a return through the increase in value of a stock, you know, these kind of very fundamental business concepts. And I think one of the corollaries of that is Noam's point, which is that there are these, you know, missing kind of almost like a fallen scale in the armor that if only folks understood better, then they'd have a lot more leverage. And I think honestly, if both sides understand their leverage more fully and bring an enlightened approach to the table, we might end up with some, I don't think all the solutions are win-win, but some of them might be. And, you know, the Kaiser Permanente example is a great example, one great example of how that can be. But here are two other elements I can think of. One is, I think we need even more symbolic victories. I think the reason why Amazon and Starbucks are so important is not just because these are unionization efforts and NLRB efforts. I think it's because those are important, iconic companies, each one of which has an enormous tie to a big piece of the economy. And some of the labor organizing that I've seen over the last 10 or 20 years has just been in industries that are either shrinking or not as important or just not as visible from a kind of arbitrary fashion perspective. And then the last piece, just speaking to arbitrary fashions, is I don't know if folks saw Union Drips, but it was an account on Twitter, at least, maybe on Instagram too, of union-inspired fashion trends. And these little cultural moments, you know, I put out a tweet a while ago about what are the best movies that feature labor organizing. And I got some, you know, answers a little all over the place, but, you know, we don't have those iconic stories yet. There are not that many iconic stories told about these heroes who are resisting power. And I think, you know, in the same way that the jungle was a critical accelerant for labor at a certain point in time, I think we're looking for those. And in fact, I've got a tiny little grant where once a month, together with some friends in and around organizing, we give a grant to a storyteller that could be a journalist or a short story writer. In fact, our first person was a TikToker exposing what was happening at Chili's. And so I think those cultural stories are important too, and the law can follow. I mean, you know, Wilma, a lesson I learned from you is that the history of labor law is the action happens first and the law follows later. So let's focus on making the action happen.
Well, Wilma, I wonder if I could turn to Phila, because she is among all of us the closest and most out there with the frontline activists, and she may have an answer to Joel's question as well to complement what Roy just said.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I actually will build right onto it. I was going to say that I think this is really a moment to be listening more to workers and centering and looking at what they're doing and how they're thinking about it. You know, we had these discussions as we were developing the report about how to really frame and position the report, given that, you know, what was brought together, I think is really an important contribution for the moment. At the same time, what we're really showing is what the field has been showing for quite some time, right? Folks that are organizing, really just this sort of diverse array of workers coming together in various forms in ways that really are a function of like who they are and the issues that they are experiencing, whether it be in the workplace or in the broader community, if we can call it that. So I think that, you know, as we're thinking about what it means, as referenced in the earlier slide, what does it mean to build more durable institutions that are worker-centered and that can, while standing the test of time, right? That's what when I say durability, that's what I think about, while also evolving, right, with time. I think that it really is about what Roy had said, thinking about, you seeing the workers that are organizing as the experts in how we do this, and then those of us that are connected to the work and supporting, whether it's through research or policy or some other thing, thinking about what does it mean to support that and the best ways necessary. The last thing I'll say, which just I think is to me a bit of an example, but highlights some important lessons and insights I think it's important to take, is I was having a conversation recently with a leader of a worker center, and our conversation sort of turned to this question about like, who is at the vanguard of the movement. And she said, she had talked about a recent trip to Bessemer. And that was sort of what I was asking her about. But she said, the vanguard of the movement is Chris Smalls. And she noted, we receive resources to go down to Bessemer to support what was happening. And that was very important. But she said, that was a foundation giving us that money to go down. And her point was, while she was grateful for that support and being able to go, her point was, the work that Chris Smalls and the many other Chris Smalls, right, are doing around the country was something that sort of happened more stealthily. I mean, right, like there were people, I think, talking and writing, like if you're close to the work. I think maybe Steve Greenhouse had written something at some point about the Staten Island work, but really it didn't make sort of this national attention or news until it actually happened, right? And I think there's a maybe useful lesson in terms of like thinking about that, and I'll just add, there's conversations now about like what it means to like put more resources into those kinds of efforts, but in a way it's becoming a bit controversial because it's framed as is it possibly going to undermine the like movement, the momentum of these like smaller, more local union organizing efforts, where, and I think this to Noam's point a little bit about controversy is in that a lot of the local level, they want to remain independent. And so I think it's interesting and useful to like think about that and like what that means and why those workers, while they do want to form into unions, are thinking about how they want to maintain their independence, autonomy, which presents an important, I think, tension that we do need to think about, because we do want to build more capacity across movement, but at the same time allow workers to really be self-determined in the work. So just, I know we need to move on.
Fela, this relates to Stephen Silva's question and then Roy's response in the chat for those of you who are seeing it. It is an innovative development to let local leaders to learn from the front lines and let the process evolve as they see fit, and then to provide support from the institutions, the existing unions and others. And so we've got to find a way for the existing organizations to learn from the front lines and then to provide resources to keep it going. And I think that's a very creative tension if we can manage it and move forward. And I think that's reflected in all of what's in the chat. I'd like to invite others to raise a question.
Could I wanted to address the question raised by Morley Gunderson, whether this historic moment going on in the US is representative as what is happening in other countries internationally. I would welcome others' comments, but let me just give my own impression. I often talk to people in Europe and even including employer groups, and they all agree, and these would be European arms of American multinationals, and they all will tell you that the US is an outlier. The US and Singapore are the outliers in terms of resistance to unionization, in terms of the kind of laissez-faire notion of our law. So I think that this historic moment in the US is also kind of an outlier, although I think things are happening globally with worker groups, particularly global alliances. But I guess I'd welcome your comments of anyone else in terms of what you see going on internationally. But to me, Roy, it goes back to the question I might have for you, which is, do you see any potential for the employer community to let up on this very outlying knee-jerk anti-unionism, not necessarily to embrace it and fall in love with it, but to let the workers fight it out themselves?
I absolutely do. This is what I think we have to believe for that to happen. One or more iconic, respected business leaders have to try some new approach, because the business world is incredibly fad driven. The second a couple of successful, respected managers do something, I mean, it's a cargo cult. Everyone will start, doing more or less exactly the same thing. And so the quest to me is to figure out who that is. And I think it's so disappointing that that Howard Schultz, who has the kind of power you need to move very hard, by the way, for many corporate leaders to do this, because they feel precarious in their own roles. They feel they're at the mercy of the board and all this fiduciary duty, and therefore they try to adhere to past norms. But if somebody's going to do it, it's probably going to ironically be a business leader who has an outsized degree of control over their own company. And that's why it's such a shame that Howard Schultz has not taken that opportunity, because I think that there is a statesperson-like opportunity to negotiate something wildly different. And we'll see what happens with Amazon there. It's complicated by the transition between Jeff Bezos and the new CEO, Andy Jassy, as to where the power actually lies. And you see Jeff, taking on Biden on Twitter, showing that he's very much still actively involved in these questions. But that's what I think we need, and I think it's possible.
Thank you. Anyone else want to weigh in on the question of either what's going on internationally or what it would take to change this gridlock that we are in and we've been in for decades, at least at the federal level?
I'll weigh in briefly just to echo Roy's point. I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think Howard Schultz, has both mystified me and played out entirely according to type. I think because I think a company like Starbucks is essentially engaged in a labor cost minimization exercise, it's not at all shocking, that he would be pretty relentlessly hostile to unions. It's both. It's partly wages and benefits, but if it were strictly a matter of wages and benefits, then I think that they would have reached some kind of deal by this point. It really is. It's just-in-time scheduling. It's this kind of widgetization of labor that gets optimized at every, I don't know what their interval is, but they schedule people in less than quarter-hour increments. And for them to not be able to do that, I think would require a reconceptualization of their kind of value proposition and the kind of story that they tell investors. So I think it's not at all surprising that he's been relentlessly hostile. It's not just kind of irrational prejudice or the product of some kind of socialization, though that's a portion of it. But that said, I think Howard Schultz, particularly by this point where we've had more than 60 stores vote to unionize, we've had petitions in more than 250 stores, it seems to be continuing to spread. You can imagine, as Roy says, someone with the authority and the stature and the control over his operation of a Howard Schultz saying, look, we're going to make our peace with this and spin it into a competitive advantage. We're going to say, we already brand ourselves, as a kind of progressive company. We want, kind of liberal-minded people buying our product, and we appeal to those people. So we're going to turn this into this competitive advantage. We're going to be a lot of companies talk about treating workers well, and they, in some cases even offer decent benefits, but we're going to just go take a huge leap beyond what any other competitor has done. And we're going to, proclaim neutrality and actually mean that we stay neutral when workers contemplate unionizing. We're not going to have anti-union consultants. We're not going to have anti-union law firms. We're actually going to leave it up to the workers, and anyone else, feel free to match us. But we think this is the right thing to do, and we think this is what our customers want and what our workers want.
Yeah, I want to build on just that last word that you just mentioned, and that's customers. You mentioned investors, and I agree. But I think the key to all of this lies with customers. These are young. Starbucks has a young demographic in its customer base. They are the colleagues of the baristas. I think that that's where this campaign would get some leverage when the customers start to organize and support the baristas. We saw that in Market Basket, a grocery chain here in New England a few years ago. That tilted the balance of power, and that led to a successful resolution. We're near the end. I see Joel has a very quick comment, and then I think we should give Wilma the last word.
Well, I posted it in the chat. I just want to say that I see many of the new arrangements crossing organizational and institutional lines in ways that involve multiple stakeholders doing together what they can't do separately. I think the 21st century will go down as a century marked by these multi-stakeholder arrangements. And so that is something that's happening globally. And so the institutional innovation around just how do you get diverse stakeholders to align laterally is a story that is larger.
So I want to thank all of you. I wanted to just make one final comment. I question, Noam, whether some of the opposition, whether it's Starbucks or Amazon to unionization, is really based on economics, or whether it's more perhaps verging on ideological. And this kind of knee-jerk reaction of American employers that we don't need any third party. I mean, one big difference with Europe, and this is North Europe, South Europe, is that whether or not they love organized labor, labor has a legitimate seat at the table. This notion of the social dialogue, the social partners, which is just an anathema here. This notion that, you know, we'll be good to our employees, we don't need a third party, and therefore they feel an obligation to have to campaign rigorously against unionization. And I think some of it, I'm sure you're right that in terms of the scheduling and certain aspects of the way the business model operates, they don't want to have to negotiate with the union. But I really question whether it's at the bottom an economic resistance or something more almost philosophical or ideological that's just in the water in the United States. Any quick response to that before I kind of wind down? I want to thank all of you really for participating, for our audience in particular. It's Adam Litwin just put toxic CEO masculinity with a question mark. I don't know, I won't go there, but thanks for the comment. I want to again urge all of you to attend the virtual LERA annual meeting. We're going to have one, I'm sure, excellent plenary session chaired by Tom Kochan, Roy Bahat, and others will be on it on the supply chain crisis. I know that Noam is also on a panel, I think, about labor journalists, if I'm not mistaken. The opening plenary session will be an interview that I conducted recently with the Secretary of Labor. There'll be another plenary session on financialization and corporate governance, and another one on antitrust law. And it's a mechanism for addressing wage suppression and income inequality. And then there, of course, will be many, many dozens of workshop sessions. So I want to thank all of you again, especially my partner in this, Tom Kochan, but also Fila, Jake, and Johnny, Noam, and Roy, and of course, to Bernadette and Emily at the LERA office. Thank you for making this happen today.
Okay.
Any last word, Tom?
No, I just put in the chat. This is why LERA exists, for this kind of dialogue, more important today than ever before. So let's just keep it up. Thank you,
all.
Wilma, for organizing this.
Yes. Bye-bye now. So